low-carb ketogenic diets work. They work for weight loss, they work for blood sugar improvements, they can improve body composition, they work. But what about the LDL, right? That's the question we get time and time again. If you're eating that much fat, right? If you're reducing your carbohydrates, what happens to your LDL? There's a concern that LDL is going to go up and it's going to increase heart disease risk. But the literature doesn't necessarily agree. Plus, what about the size and the density of the LDL particles? Could it be favorable in that way? I'm Dr. Brett Scher, the medical director at DietDoctor.com, and the answer to this is yes. I mean, the low carb and keto diets can actually improve the size of your LDL particles, and according to most of the literature out there, it does not raise your total LDL and may even decrease it. Now we have a meta-analysis which backs this up. This meta-analysis was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and some of the authors were Dr. Jonathan Little and Dr. Ethan Weiss. Now, hopefully you know Dr. Weiss from this, from our YouTube channel and our podcast. We've had him on before. And let's talk about what this study showed, because I think it's really important. What they did was they took randomized controlled trials of any length that were a low-carb diet versus a control diet. And it could have been some other intervention diet, but they called it control diet because it was low carb versus some other diet, right? And they had to be an independent diet study, which I think is really important. It wasn't, also with medications or also with exercise. It was independently just changing the diet. So they found 38 randomized controlled trials that included 1,785 people. 6 were for weight loss. 6 studies were for weight loss specifically. 31 were for weight maintenance, and 1 was sort of a combination of both. Now, they ranged from 3 days to 12 months, which is obviously a huge range, and maybe that's one of the weaknesses of this meta-analysis, that there was such a huge range in time frame. I would have liked it to see more towards the longer studies, because the shorter studies maybe don't predict quite as much. But what they found was by synthesizing all this data, there was a significant increase in the peak size of the LDL particles. Now, let's talk about that because it's sort of important. Not all LDL is necessarily the same. It's pretty clear from the literature that the smaller and more dense LDL particles are more harmful than the larger, less dense LDL particles. That's different from saying you don't have to worry at all about larger LDL particles. That's a different question altogether. But it's pretty clear that the smaller LDL particles are more concerning. They can stay in the circulation longer. They're less likely to be cleared by the LDL receptors. They're more likely to get oxidized. They're more likely to be retained in the proteoglycans and in the vessel wall. So they're definitely more of a concern, and observational data show they're definitely associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So all things being equal, you would like your LDL particles to be larger. And that's what this meta-analysis shows, that it was clear that those following low-carb diets had the larger LDL particles, not the smaller LDL particles. Now, interesting, the mean size didn't change, but the peak size changed. Part of that could have been fewer studies measuring the mean size and more of them measuring the peak size, but that's an interesting difference. They also found a significant reduction in the concentration of the small dense LDL, which also makes sense, that there were fewer small particles. There was less concentration of the small LDL cholesterol, which obviously is a beneficial change as well. But here's the kicker. There was also a reduction in the total LDL particles. So when we talk about LDL, we can talk about LDL cholesterol, the concentration of the cholesterol, or we could talk about ApoB, which is basically a surrogate for how many LDL particles there are, and remnant particles, so IDL and VLDL. Or we talk about LDL particles themselves, which are the actual number of LDL particles. You can think about it, an analogy I like to use, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, though, is traffic caused by the number of people in the cars or the number of cars on the road, right? Traffic is caused by the number of cars on the road. So when it comes to LDL, the concentration of LDL may not be as important as the number of LDL particles, and the literature does seem to support that. And what their meta-analysis shows was that the LDL particle number actually went down. So here's the thing. This is just more evidence that when it comes to low-carb diets, LDL is not a concern for the majority of people. And I think that's so important because the initial reaction of physicians and especially cardiologists is you can't go on a low-carb diet or a keto diet because it's going to raise your LDL. But that is simply not true for the majority of people. And here's a meta-analysis that shows not only does the LDL particle number go down, but the size of the LDL particles improve. So you can actually improve your LDL on a low-carb diet. Exactly the opposite of what a big assumption is regarding low-carb diet. So hats off to Dr. Weiss and Dr. Little for publishing this, and their colleagues, of course, for publishing this, because it goes against sort of maybe some of the traditional thinking in cardiology and lipidology. Now, is this the end-all be-all? No, I mean, whenever you have a meta-analysis, there's difference in patient population, there's difference in study design, there's difference in time. So there are, some weaknesses to this, but it adds to the literature that, wait a second, we have to be cautious about making assumptions about what happens to LDL when you eat fat, when you eat saturated fat. Now, pair this to the recent studies by Dr. Lucia Aronica and Christopher Gardner, from their Diet Fit study, showing that as you increase saturated fat intake or as you increase dietary cholesterol intake, your LDL does not significantly increase either. So we're getting more evidence to show this, and I'm thankful for it, because time and time again, that's people's biggest concern is the LDL. All right, I hope this was helpful. If it was, click the thumbs up and the subscribe button below so you make sure you get all the updates here from Diet Doctor News on YouTube. Thanks a lot and have a great day, everybody.